Okay, welcome everybody to a new episode of The Solar Journey. My guest today is Andrew Blakers, professor at the Australian National University, a long-term PV scientist, co-inventor of the PERC solar cell and many other valuable contributions to the energy transition. For example, he's a strong supporter of pumped hydro for energy storage. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you, Torsten.
Yeah, at this point, right in the beginning, I want to add that from 1993 onwards, for around 13 months or so, I did my Diplomarbeit, the back then German equivalent to a master thesis with Andrew Blakers at the Australian National University. This was a formative time for me at the beginning of my solar career. And I often look back and it gives me a big smile also today after 30 years. Yeah, this is not only because I got to see wallabies on my regular run up Black Mountain, just behind my student dormitory, but of course, because I learned so much from Andrew. So again, Andrew, thanks so much for giving me the chance back then. Yeah.
Oh, it was great to have you.
Yeah. What comes to your mind when you think of 1994 and me being at your institute? I think you just started your department.
Yes, so I spent 10 years or 11 years at the University of New South Wales in the group of Martin Green. And then in 1991, late 1991, I came to ANU and spent a couple of years setting up, or a year or so, setting up my laboratory. And then gathering money. Of course, money is what makes the whole thing work. And so I spend a lot of time looking for money, and I was fortunate to find sufficient to keep the group going, and it still flourishes today.
Excellent, yeah. Yeah, so when was your start into solar? And back then, did you imagine witnessing the energy transition that we are seeing now in terms of costs and level of deployment of solar and wind?
Well, I did physics and maths at the Australian National University, and I was going to be an astronomer. And then I took up walking in national parks and wilderness areas and realized that my background would be much better used for solar energy. It was completely obvious that greenhouse was going to be a major problem. And the only question was how fast the damage would occur and whether we could forestall most of the damage. So back in 1979, of course, I couldn't foresee the ins and outs, but I went to the University of New South Wales, and I was a second PhD student of Professor Martin Green, and I did my PhD there and 3 or 4 postdocs, and spent a substantial amount of time there working on high performance silicon solar cells. And I decided right back then that crystalline silicon was the path to large scale solar.
Yeah.
In fact, the path to large scale energy. And this has proved to be absolutely correct. Never bet against silicon.
Never bet against silicon. We'll come to your contribution to technology and why silicon is the best a bit later. Let's focus for the start on what's happening right now and also in Australia. So what can you tell us about the transition in place and progress towards the 80% renewables by 2030 target in Australia?
So Australia has a federal government with support from all of the state governments that is aiming for a rapid change to high levels of solar and wind in its electricity system. The prime motivation for this is a very unpleasant situation in 2022 and 2021 as well, during the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when energy prices went very high. And basically a decision was made that we will never place ourselves at the mercy of international prices for gas and coal again. And the way to do that is to move rapidly to solar and wind for electricity production. So the federal government has a policy of reaching 82% renewables by 2030. We're currently at 41%. No very great difficulties are seen in doubling our solar and wind over the next 6 years. and it's introduced something called the Capacity Investment Scheme, which basically sets floor and ceiling prices for companies to bid for solar and wind. And then once the companies have had a bid accepted, they have a clear risk mitigation process, but also in the sense that if the prices of energy ever go high, the government will claw back some of the money that was perhaps expended to avoid prices falling too low for these developers. So in a nutshell, we are going to end up with a rapid move to 82% pretty much locked in, provided that the government does not change at the next election, which is held next year.
Yeah. So is there across the, let's say, population and all across the party, a common goal to reach that? Or do you think that with a changing government, this target could be scrapped?
Because energy is primarily a state function and the Commonwealth role is more coordination, a change of government to a hostile government, which is possible in May next year, would lead to a delay, but not a stop to the rapid move towards solar and wind. We had a hostile government for 10 years, and because we have an open market, anyone can connect. The state governments more or less run energy. That didn't stop Australia becoming the global renewable energy pathfinder.
Yeah, yeah. Talking about the pathfinder, rooftop solar in Australia has been a runaway success stories. Almost 1 in 3 homes have a rooftop PV system. Can you imagine that a saturation point will arrive at some point and deployment slow, so that it move more towards large scale, utility scale application?
We barely started on our rooftop solar. 1 in 3 homes had rooftop solar. That will probably go to 2 in 3. And we've barely started in the commercial space for warehouses and factories and shopping centres and car parks.
Yeah.
So, we could easily end up with 2, 3, even 4 times as much annual energy generation from rooftops as we currently derive. So I think that we'll end up with something like a quarter of our electricity coming from rooftops after we completely decarbonize, meaning that we use clean electricity to get rid of fossil fuels out of transport, heating, industry, and aviation fuels.
Yeah, yeah. For some time, we've heard also in Germany, there was the saying in 20, 30 years ago, we've heard that grid operators and utilities warn of instability with large amounts of rooftop PV, or in general, distributed energy generation, fluctuating energy generation. In some Australian state capitals, I understand that there are times when 100% of a state's electricity demand is supplied by rooftop PV. What are you seeing in terms of system instability?
These prognostications are garbage. That's a technical term. So I'll translate for you. Nonsense, wrong, demonstrably wrong, completely and totally irrelevant.
Yeah.
So just come to Australia. Anyone who believes that high levels of solar, wind, rooftop solar destabilizes your grid, well, it can happen if you do nothing to avoid that destabilization. But if you take the steps that the Australian Energy Market Operator and various other bodies in Australia take, then it does not destabilize your grid.
Yeah. Yeah.
So recently, about a year ago in South Australia, the entire state derived sufficient electricity from rooftop solar to meet all of its demand. South Australia is weakly connected through transmission to the eastern states, and it has a small amount of compulsory gas generation for system stability. That small amount of gas generation goes down every year as the system operator learns that it's less and less required, and as more and more storage enters the system and as interconnection to the eastern states becomes stronger. So the take-home message is, if you plan for it and work for it and do the basic modifications to the way the system operates, rooftop solar will not destabilize your grid. Quite the contrary, we are going to end up with a far more robust and reliable energy system than we had when we had fossil fuels. And this is very simple to demonstrate. So in the old days, we had a dozen large coal and gas powered stations. And so if you lose one of them from a fire, you can lose 10% of your generation inside a second. We are going to end up with millions of rooftop systems and thousands of solar farms and wind farms and a network of transmission going everywhere, and millions of batteries and dozens of pumped hydro systems and very sophisticated demand management. So the possibility that an accident or a deliberate act of sabotage or any other thing could destabilize your electricity system becomes vanishingly small.
Yeah.
Not even weather is capable of doing this, because weather takes several days to cross from west to east. So you can see the weather coming for days, even weeks in advance. So you will not be surprised.
Yeah.
And the upshot of this is we are going to end up with a much more reliable energy system that's also cheaper and has zero emissions.
Yeah. So at the core is the modularity, right? So that you have this distributed modular energy generation system, rather than monopolies in single spots. Yeah. Less vulnerable.
Yeah. Instead of a few transmission lines to a few power stations, any one of which could go down, you have a network. And everyone knows that networks are more stable than hub and spoke.
Yeah, yeah. Excellent. Thanks for that. Talking about monopolies, I've seen there's also or is a debate about nuclear energy in Australian politics. Of course, globally, solar and wind is surging past nuclear in terms of capacity additions and even generation. How do you see the nuclear discussion playing out in Australia?
It's a stalking horse for gas. So the fossil fuel industry has very strong connections into conservative politics. I don't think anyone who looks at this for 5 minutes reaches any conclusion other than nuclear has missed the boat. To put it in perspective, last year the world did about 500 gigawatts of new solar and wind and 0 net new gigawatts of nuclear. The nuclear capacity around the world and nuclear generation has been static for the last dozen years and shows no sign of increasing. So solar capacity passed nuclear capacity in 2017, and both solar and wind will have passed nuclear generation around 2027, and then we'll just zoom away. In Australia, there is no nuclear energy. It's just ludicrous to imagine that we're going to set up a vast nuclear apparatus to run nuclear power stations. But waving and around nuclear power stations, talking about them, means that a future Conservative government might argue that, oh, we've just got to have gas running for another 10 years and then the nuclear will be ready. It is a stalking horse for gas. It is not a serious proposition that we're going to build nuclear.
Yeah, I think the same in the US and also Germany. Just turned off the last nuclear reactors 2 years ago or so, or 1 year ago. And again, the kind of conservative parties claim that this was a big mistake, even though they actually decided to, back 10 years ago, to go this way. Have you ever understood why always conservative parties tend to propose or support the nuclear gas industry? You could think that they are the ones, when it's about conserving nature, they should be the one who go another way, right? It's a bit.
Well, conservative parties have a terrible record on conservation and environment. I think there's a deep-seated perception that solar and wind are somehow leftist technologies, that it's practically communist. It's going to destabilize their mates who run the fossil fuel industry. I mean, it's not a lot different to the demise of cigarette advertising around the world. So there was it's been very obvious for the last 60, 80, even 100 years that cigarettes are bad for your health. So that smoking industry conducted a very successful rearguard action, and it was primarily the Conservative parties that aided and abetted that rearguard action. So this other smoking industry, namely fossil fuels, is adopting exactly the same playbook, and will attempt to have a rearguard action. And they're Relatively successful. The only problem for them is that the cost of wind, and in particular solar, just keeps going down.
Yeah. I think it's interesting to observe Texas, right? Which is, in a way, you could say a conservative, but they also have now very large progressive communities in Austin and Dallas. But in the way, it's in general a conservative state. But they let almost free market rule the energy market, and there you see a gigantic growth of solar. And I think that's a fantastic example how solar and wind just also beat anything else in a really free market, right?
Yeah, when you have an open market, you have price discovery, and the price discovery is that solar and wind are cheaper than everything else.
Yeah.
So Australia is #1 for seaborne coal exports, and #3, I think, or 2 for liquefied natural gas seaborne exports. So we have a very large fossil fuel mafia in Australia. But through an accident of history, we ended up with an open electricity market. Anybody who meets technical specifications can connect in, whether it's a rooftop solar or a large solar and wind farm. And through 10 years of hostile conservative government, these pesky companies and these annoying individuals just kept connecting. And so Australia ended up as the global renewable energy pathfinder. We have more solar generation per person than any other country. We're very good for wind as well. And importantly, the other top dozen countries for per capita solar and wind are all in Europe, who share electricity across national boundaries. But in Australia, we have to go it alone. And we are demonstrating that it's really remarkably straightforward.
Yeah. Talking about going alone, what do you think of the AA Powerlink project, which targets to power substantially Singapore, I think up to 10 or 15% of their electricity consumption, with a 20 gigawatt TV system in Australia's National Northern Territory and a 5,000 kilometer long DC subsea cable? So actually, Australia would turn into an exporter of electricity.
It hasn't been built. I don't think
it hasn't been built.
The problem for this system is it's a 4,000 or 5,000 kilometer long cable, which is 5 or 6 times longer than any other undersea cable in the world. It has to traverse the Timor Trench, which is about 1.9 kilometers of depth, which is utterly unprecedented for an undersea cable. But above all, it has to compete with Sumatra in Indonesia, which is 50 kilometers away across a shallow sea from Singapore, and Borneo, Sarawak, for example, the state of Malaysia in Borneo, which is 700 kilometers away across a shallow sea. And both those jurisdictions are very keen to supply to Singapore and Peninsular Malaysia, and can produce electricity at a price that's fully competitive with what Australia can do without the incredibly long, incredibly deep cable.
Yeah.
So, I think the Sun Cable proposal is gradually turning itself around. A lot of people have said, well, you know, build this enormous solar and wind up in the north centre of Australia. You know, supply Darwin, which is on the way to Singapore, but just stop there and send the rest of the energy south, where most Australians live.
Yeah, yeah. All right, we should keep it observing. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's mind-boggling, right? That these projects and these ideas, these concepts come up. I think that's a good indicator of where we are, how far we got, right?
Yes and no. There's been large numbers of large projects announced, and the number that actually built is not necessarily all that large.
Yeah.
Most of the clean hydrogen projects are falling over one by one because of just mind-bogglingly bad economics.
Yeah, yeah. I wasn't about to touch base on hydrogen, but now that you raised that topic, do you want to comment on what's going on in anything with hydro, etc.?
Okay, so the chemical symbol for hydrogen is H, and of course H actually stands for hype.
Yeah.
So I've been around in solar for long enough to remember 3 or 4 hydrogen hype episodes, and we are just coming off the back of about the 4th of them. People discover hydrogen. Oh, you can do all sorts of things with hydrogen. Well, that's perfectly true. But almost always you can do that thing better by some other way. So in a nutshell, hydrogen has almost no part to play in the energy system. But in the chemical system, you need lots and lots of hydrogen atoms, and that's where clean hydrogen will come. And that's a job for the 2030s and 2040s, to decarbonize production of ammonia and metals and synthetic aviation, shipping fuels, ceramics, plastics. It's not a job for the 2020s. Our job in the 2020s is to decarbonize electricity and land transport. And then in the 2030s, we can move on to looking seriously at the chemical industry. But hydrogen has no part in the energy industry. You're better off, when you make clean electricity, just keeping it as electricity.
I saw concepts, or actually built motorcycles with an hydrogen engine. Same for trams, which is ridiculous because they have always been electrified, right? And with trains, etc., right? It's amazing, the hype around it. So I assume you know Michael Liebreich's hydrogen ladder? No? Okay. No. All right.
I say far away from hydrogen because you look at it for a few minutes and you realize this is nonsense from basic dynamics. The dreadful round trip efficiency of turning clean solar and wind into clean hydrogen and then compressing it and shipping it and then turning it back into electricity or transport fuel with a round trip efficiency of maybe 30%. And if you just keep it all as electricity, the problem goes away. So we in Australia get pestered by Korean and Japanese energy officials coming along and saying, oh, you can make hydrogen for us. And I just look at them and say, what's wrong with your own solar and wind? So Korea and Japan have extraordinarily good and extraordinarily extensive offshore wind around the Korean Peninsula and in the Sea of Japan. Japan, for example, has got 50 times more offshore wind potential in its territorial waters than it would ever need to reach 100% renewables with 0 fossil fuels. Why on earth would you want to develop anything else?
I guess the same is
Japan. Japan is going from 120 million today down to about 100 million by 2050, and that frees up an awful lot of agricultural land that you can put panels on.
Let's move to something that I think makes sense. We'll learn more about you more about it from you. I know that you've been active in creating the Global Pumped Hydro Atlas. Can you tell us how that works and who was involved?
Okay, so about 95% of all the energy storage for the electricity industry is pumped hydro, and everything else together is the last 5%, and that's not going to change anytime soon.
So that's for Australia, or what do you?
The world.
The world.
For the world. In Australia, there's a pumped hydro system called Snow 2.0, which is under construction, and it's larger than all of the utility batteries in the whole world put together several times. The pumped hydro is basically pumping water uphill between 2 reservoirs when it's sunny and windy, and when you need the energy back, like the middle of the night, the water comes back down through the turbine to recover the energy, and the round trip efficiency is about 80%. So you put in 100 units of energy to push the water uphill, and you'll get back about 80 units. For a battery, you'd get back maybe 90 units. So they're both pretty high efficiency compared with hydrogen, which you'd get back only 30 units. But almost all pumped hydro systems in the world are on rivers in conjunction with existing hydroelectric systems. And we wondered, well, rivers are about 1% of the global landscape. What about the other 99%? So we did a high resolution survey of the entire world at a horizontal resolution of about 30 meters and a vertical resolution of about 1 meter. And we found 820,000 good sites with a combined total of about 86 million gigawatt hours. So to put this in perspective, This is the same amount of energy as the electricity potential storage as the world produces in 3 years. It is also equivalent to about 1,000 billion, a trillion electric vehicle batteries. So if you want serious energy storage, there's only really one option, and that's pumped hydro. And it's an extremely good option because it's off the shelf, cheap, mature, highly engineered, highly understood, financeable, 100-year life energy storage technology. So the future of energy storage is solved. I mean, overnight storage is simply not an issue for most places in the world. And it's basically batteries for short-term storage of seconds up to hours, and pumped hydro for hours to days. And almost all parts of the world have unlimited pumped hydro, actually, except for Northern Europe, which is where you're located. The north of the Alps, there's not much opportunity.
Yeah. So what do we do? Turn off the lights at night, or?
No, not at all. I'll explain how Europe energy system will go, unless Europe planners are nuts. So just to carry on one moment further, you can find our pumped hydro atlas. You can zoom into all 820,000 sites by just Googling for ANU pumped hydro global atlas or something like that. You'll quickly find it, and you can zoom and pan and tilt and rotate and get 26 items of information in pop-ups for every one of the 800,000 sites around the world, including sites in your backyard. And they're color-coded for cost, ranging from Class E, which is good but not very good, up to Class A. And then we have the premium classes at AA and AAA. And there's a factor of 10 difference in the cost of a pumped hydro that's AAA rated compared with Class E rated. So there's a very wide range of sizes from 2 up to 5,000 gigawatt hours. So extremely wide range. 2 gigawatt hours is where batteries leave off. 5,000 gigawatt hours is 2,500 very large batteries, and is suitable for about 80 million or 100 million people.
Yeah. Wonderful.
So Europe is slightly nuts. I read so many articles about how can we make sure that France or Germany or Britain or some other country can become 100% renewables. Well, with difficulty, but you all live in Europe. And it is completely obvious that a European-wide transmission network is required. So that means that strong interconnection must cross the Alps, north to south and east to west. And you would end up with a system that basically harvests mind-bogglingly large amounts of electricity from extraordinarily good wind offshore in the Baltic and North Sea and Irish Sea, and sends that electricity south across the Alps to meet solar energy coming from the south to the north. And there's one other quirk. Europe has very large scale off-river pumped hydro potential in the south. The Alps is restricted both because it's too steep and because of national parks, but the Balkans has very large scale potential pumped hydro, which you can see clearly and easily if you go and look at the pumped hydro atlas. Mm-hmm. So the solar can be stored in the pumped hydro and soak in the wind for distribution east, west, north, south to wherever it needs to go.
Yeah. So
it's a solid, everything's off the shelf.
Off the shelf. So the Balkans, the new power storage hub for Europe.
Yeah, but the number one requirement is get over the phobia of transmission. If you've got to bury the transmission because of social pushback, then so be it. But those who object to power lines crossing landscapes, well, perhaps we could have a nice little open cut coal mine there instead.
Yeah, I never understood the discussion about the power lines. Yeah. So what's the next option next to pumped hydro, if for whatever reasons?
What else do you need?
Sorry, I couldn't. There was a
pumped hydro and batteries. What else do you need?
Okay. Yeah.
So batteries take care of short-term storage. Pumped hydro takes care of overnight and longer-term storage. The important thing is both together are much better than either separately.
Yeah.
The reason for this is that pumped hydro is relatively expensive for power, but very cheap for energy,
Yeah.
whereas batteries is the opposite. So if you have both, you end up with a low energy and low power cost.
Excellent. Thanks a lot for the in-depth explanation on that. Let's jump to
Perhaps I can just add one more thing, Torsten.
Sure. Sorry.
Yeah, I think this is a very important point, that energy overnight storage is really a solved problem. So the cost of large-scale off-river pumped hydro is in the vicinity of $20 per kilowatt hour. So this is less than 1/10 the cost of an equivalent battery.
Yeah.
So the cost of pumped hydro is extraordinarily low. The Snow 2.0 system under construction in Australia that I mentioned comes in at $23 per kilowatt hour, and it's not a particularly good site by world standards. Pumped hydro is extraordinarily cheap for energy, and there's an extraordinarily large amount of it.
Yeah. Is it operating, or I think you mentioned it's being built, right?
Well, there's 200 gigawatts of pumped hydro already operating around the world. And
no, I meant the Snowy.
The Snowy 2.0 system is scheduled for operation in 4 years' time.
All right. Okay. Excellent. We should talk latest then. Let's move on to, let's say, solar power policy, right? The generation part. So there has been the debate about the dominance of China in terms of the PV manufacturing supply chain. And for example, the IEA has repeatedly described this as a risk. And also there's a large activities in Europe, Germany, for example, to bring back manufacturing locally. India is making big moves towards that, and the US is also, let's say, trying. The initial successes can be seen. What are you thinking in this regard?
What a waste of time. So China makes most of the world's solar panels. It is a non-issue, and I'll explain why. So when we have brought everybody up to the same living standard as Europe or Australia or the United States, then the per capita electricity consumption will be about 10 megawatt hours per person per year. And we need to double that in order to decarbonize transport, heating, and industry, maybe even a bit more than that. So we end up with 20 megawatt hours per person per year for 10 billion affluent people. So that's 200,000 terawatt hours per year is the global electricity production requirement. And you could do the whole job with about 100 gigawatts of 100 terawatts of solar. And you'd build that over a period of 25 years and replace it over a period of 25 years. So you've got to divide that 100 terawatts by 25. So that's 4 terawatts per year of solar panels will be sold. And the current wholesale price is 12 US cents per watt. It'll fall to 10 or 8. And so the upper bound on the global market for solar panels is about 400 billion per year US. And that is 7 times smaller than the global car industry and is a tiny, tiny fraction of the global gross domestic product. It turns out that it's $40 per person per year to buy solar panels to continually replace their existing solar panels. So the industry size can never be large. And this is another way of saying that solar panels are so cheap, and they're going to get even cheaper. Now we come to the so-called risk. Suppose that for any reason, pandemic, politics, war, whatever, China turned off solar panel production tomorrow. Well, the existing solar panels continue to operate. It would be an inconvenience. The other parts of the world would need to build their own solar panel manufacturing, but there's nothing intrinsic about China. anyone can build a solar panel manufacturing factory, perhaps at a slightly higher price, but the price is so low that's neither here nor there. Compare that with getting your coal, oil and gas turned off today. You would know about that within a week or two. So you're talking about years of forewarning that we have a problem, we better build our solar cell factories, compared with weeks of, oh dear, what are we going to do? We've just lost our coal, oil and gas supply. So it is not a risk.
Yeah.
It's an annoyance.
It's an annoyance. Thanks so much.
Something goes wrong.
Yeah. Thanks for the clear statement and very clear figures. That's a good top-down view. Thanks a lot.
I find it quite remarkable that people who make these statements don't sit down and do the calculation. It takes about 10 minutes to work out the upper bound size of the global solar panel industry.
Yeah.
400 billion US per year, upper bound. Can never be larger than that.
Yeah. That's what I always liked when I was a student at your university. You always came up with very simple calculations on the direction of things, right? And rather than making them complicated, you are a master in making things simple. And that was another cool example. Thanks. Still, there are numerous policy measures, as I mentioned, in India, US, Europe, and I think there was a legislation passed very recently in Australia to incentivize solar manufacturing. So I guess you think that's wasted money, or can this somehow be well spent?
It could be well spent. There's no reason that all the manufacturing has to be in China, but when you've got an integrated ecosystem, industrial ecosystem as China has, it's pretty hard to compete. However, it is perfectly feasible that you could produce panels in other countries with a cost premium that's tolerable, 10, 20, 30, 40%. And some countries, for geopolitical reasons, such as India, might decide to go solar panel manufacturing in a big way. So if there is really a desire to diversify away from China, my suggestion would be go and talk to the Indians.
Yeah. So what this money from Australia would go to India? That's what you're suggesting?
It
the
could.
Australian policy.
I kind of doubt that money would go, but you could imagine, buying shares in Indian solar panel manufacturing, for example.
Yeah.
But as I said, it's about the fifth order issue in the decarbonisation of the world.
Yeah, yeah. Talking about opinions, and you just stated one very clearly against many others. What do you think is your most unpopular opinion in the field of solar and the energy transition, but which is very important to you?
Keep it simple, stupid. So you mentioned that there is many detailed studies on this, that, and the other thing. And you just look at them and think, this is so damn complicated that you're trying to find something in a forest where if you don't have a forest, you can easily see what it is you're trying to find.
Yeah.
So many modelers fail to understand that you cannot have a higher precision output from your model than the precision of your input data. So if your input data, such as what will be the price of solar panels in 20 years' time, is known to 30, 40%, no better, then there's no point having vast numbers of inputs into your model at the 1 or 2% impact level. Just have what's important, and that's the solar and the wind and batteries and pumped hydro storage and the transmission. Everything else is just confuses things.
Yeah.
So keep it simple. 2 significant figures maximum in your input data and your output data.
Yeah.
And then you can actually see what's going on.
Yeah. Is that a skill you learn somehow, or just developed over time?
I got trained as physicists do back of the envelope calculation all the time. Is the universe going to collapse? Let's look at it. We've got 12 different parameters, and we know them to within 100 or 200% precision, extremely fuzzily. Let's just not try and work out what the universe will do at 1% precision, because we don't have the precision of input data. So let's have a look at the rule of thumb. Oh yeah, it looks like it might. Yeah, these are the 3 important parameters. Let's focus on those.
Yeah, I just had an interview also with Jenny Chase, the Bloomberg solar analyst. And for her, it's also, of course, all about forecasts, right? And where does the industry go? And she's also training in natural sciences. And she said, in the end, the models, they need to fit on the back on the envelope, right? For very similar reasons that you mentioned, yeah. And she's famous for very good forecasts.
Yeah. And someone who spends 2 years adding in 26 different other parameters will not have a better forecast. It'll probably be worse.
Yeah.
And certainly more confusing.
Right. Let's jump topics and kind of, at least for many, I think, to the core of what you have contributed to solar, which is the PERC solar cell. You were an important team member of the, let's say, PERC team. I don't know if you even called yourself that. Who else was there? What were their roles? What was yours? And roughly, what was the time span when you started and basically had it finished, version 1 of the PERC cell?
So I joined
history lesson, yeah.
I joined the University of New South Wales in 1979 as a PhD student, and spent 1979 through 1989 there. So when I joined, it was a very small team led by Martin Green, and one of the key focuses of the team, not the only one, was high efficiency single crystal silicon solar cells, with an eye also to multicrystalline and concentrator silicon solar cells. So after a year or two, I ended up more or less in charge of the high performance single crystal silicon solar cell program. And there was people drifting in and out, doing PhDs, being postdocs for a while or whatever. But most of the papers, or all of the relevant papers, were first authored by Martin Green or myself, half each. We produced a series of world record efficient cells for the time. We reported an efficiency of 18%, and then 19%, and then 20% single crystal silicon. These are 4 square centimeter cells. And that 20% number was reported in 1986. And then it became clear that we couldn't get much further with the existing techniques that we were using. And the main impediment was a lack of cleanliness. So we really had to deal with metals getting into our silicon in dirty furnaces. That was, I think, the number 1 problem. And there were several other groups around the world, in particular the group at Louvain, headed by Pierre Verlinden, who then went to the group at Stanford University, which was a very fine group, who in the end founded SunPower and set all sorts of world records. And they were developing high performance concentrator silicon cells, and for that they needed high resistivity silicon with long minority carrier lifetimes. And it became clear to us and to them and to everybody eventually that there's this magic chemical called chlorine, and you could bleed a little bit of chlorine into your furnace during the oxidation, which did absolute wonders for keeping metals out of the silicon. And once you had done that, suddenly it became imperative that you look carefully at what was going on the back surface of your cell, because the diffusion length was now longer than the cell thickness. And having got rid of the metals in our silicon wafers at end of process, we then turned our attention to oxidizing the back surface with small area contacts to the silicon to minimize recombination at the back surface. And it had the added advantage that the back surface metal was now sitting up on a dielectric, which meant the reflectivity got better. And all of this came together for us in 1988. when suddenly we were getting open circuit voltages above 700 millivolts. It was quite clear that that would translate fairly quickly into high efficiencies, and we reported a 22% efficiency in 1989, around about the same time as Stanford was doing the same. So, I mean, Stanford really was influential over what we did, and perhaps hopefully we were helpful also to Stanford. Richard Swanson and Ron Sinton and a bunch of other people. So together we were reporting 22% efficient cells at about the same time, and then eventually they went on to 25% at University of New South Wales. And the other two key people who had joined the group in the late 1980s were Ewa Wang and Jianhua Zhao. And the four of us eventually were awarded the Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering for the PERC cell last year, and had a great time going off to meet the King, Charles, in Buckingham Palace. Well, I'd been to Buckingham Palace from the outside before, but going inside is really something. I mean, the British do royalty extremely well. It was a hugely enjoyable event.
All right. What was for dinner? Did you get dinner?
No, it was canapes. But being able to wander around a small section of Buckingham Palace from the inside was really lovely. And Princess Anne was the person who announced the award back in February. I remember in January getting called up by Lord Brown, who was chair of the selection committee, and starting to talk about this prize. And I thought, oh yeah, you know, what scam is this? And then it slowly dawned on me that this is the real Lord Brown, and that I better take this seriously.
Yeah, amazing, amazing. Yeah, I think for the non-Commonwealth people, the prize is not so well known, but I assume it's. Can you rate it in terms of for on an international scale? It's not Nobel Prize. It's more like an. How do you put that into context, right, to get a understanding for non-Commonwealth?
Okay, so there is a ranking for prizes, remarkably.
All right. Now there we go.
Nobel Prize is ranked at 1.0, and there's one or two prizes in the physical sciences and technology at 0.6 or 0.7, and then there's a Queen Elizabeth Prize and one or two of the other engineering prizes at 0.5.
All right.
And there are other prizes below that, so it's not a Nobel Prize for sure.
Yeah.
But it's ostensibly half a Nobel Prize.
Yeah, you earned it, and I think everybody's happy for you that you got this this prize. Excellent stuff. Back then, did you know it was something special you were working on, and when was it actually PERC? I guess at some stage it was just making that silicon wafer transforming more efficiently sunlight into electricity. When was it a baby called PERC, or was there even that stage when it became that a PERC? Did you ever call it PERC? Hey, PERC, I'm gonna help you be better.
So during the 1980s, we produced a number of cells. There was MIMP and PESC, which standard for various things. PESC was the precursor to PERC. It was passivated emitter solar cell. The first big break we had in the early 80s was to really pay attention to passivating the top surface of low resistivity cells, which had diffusion lengths smaller than the wafer thickness. So that meant not just passivating most of the surface between the metal grids, but also producing passivation under the metal grid using oxides and polycrystalline silicon on occasion, or very small contacts, or all three. Then when we got rid of the junk out of our silicon and had to pay attention to the back surface, then it had to be the passivated emitter and rear cell, so PERC, and that's what we called it. And that's the name that stuck. And of course, it's been through a huge number of permutations and combinations on the journey to commercialization. And UNSW had not a lot to do with the commercialization, which was carried out in various labs around the world, in a very large effort to turn a lab object into something that could actually produce at very large scale. but according to the roadmap for PV, total PERC sales to date are about $150 billion, and it's in about half the cells made to date.
Yeah.
However, other technologies are rapidly taking over, as everyone knows.
Yeah, yeah. And back then, did you expect that it would become a mainstream technology, right? I mean, you were working in the lab on those small cells and trying to push the efficiency, also have this mainly drive from a technological perspective, right? How can I just optimize this? Could you envision that it would be such a mainstream thing deployed all over the world?
Yes. So even very early, there were some large systems, multi-megawatt systems, such as the Arco solar system and a few others. And we visited them, and so we could see multi-megawatt power stations on trackers, and that's a description of what happens today, except it might be multi-gigawatt systems on trackers, or not on trackers, as the case may be. So envisaging little cells becoming big commercial cells was not difficult, and things haven't changed all that much. I mean, the commercial cells are obviously much bigger, might have double or triple the diameter, but they're still crystalline silicon, and they still have metal contacts on the front and the back, and they look much the same, and they're packaged behind glass, and all of that was worked out by people back in the 70s remarkably well. So whether PERC would become big was, of course, uncertain, but I've always thought that high efficiency was going to beat cheap, low efficiency. And that's one of the reasons I always mostly worked on single crystal silicon.
Yeah.
And so I could envisage very, very large scale production, something that looked like PERC.
Yeah. You just mentioned the community that developed the module design, right? Who do you think were the key pioneers for designing the module structure, which is basically in a way still valid today, still used today?
Well, the module structure, of course, was developed back in the 70s. Glass, EVA, Tedlar back. The polymers might change, but the glass might be improved. For the process of turning a PERC lab cell into a PERC production cell, there were many people who contributed. Several groups in Germany had very major contributions to that work. Working out the right dielectric to use on the back surface, for example, working out how to deposit the rear surface that was making good contact to the silicon, and you could also solder, and that wouldn't drive its way through the rear dielectric. There were so many, and working out the correct trapped charge in your dielectric to accumulate the back surface. There were so many people contributing. It'd be a bit unfair to point to this or that. So I never imagined that my role was anything other than a very small role in a very large collaborative effort.
Yeah.
It's just easy to point to that particular role at the Uni of New South Wales, and say, that's the invention of the PERC cell. Well, you have to talk about Stanford and Levan and all the people who came after. It's highly collaborative.
Yeah. Excellent. Was there any IP on the PERC cell? And basically, when you look from innovation, like when you had the first PERC cell and when you look at the time span that it takes to bring into commercial production, you could argue that even if there was initial IP, it quite often, just like for the heterojunction solar cell, right? It just took ages to get volume, that it rarely makes sense to file for patents because it just takes so long to bring it into on a commercial level. Yeah. So was there IP on PERC, and what do you think about IP in solar, particularly solar cell tech? Yeah.
So looking back at the PERC, it would have been difficult, I think, to get IP that would stick, because so many people had so many ideas that contributed, or maybe didn't contribute, but nevertheless looked something like PERC. It also took 20 years or so before it reached large-scale production, so the patents would have expired. And at the time, we took a decision we would not try and patent. And in retrospect, that was the right decision. In general, patenting, patenting a general solar cell design, I think, is really hard. There's so many people who've thought of so many things that there'll be prior art somewhere for almost everything. But if you can think of something, a little quirk that confers, 5% advantage spread across 400 billion per year sales, then that's not insignificant. So good luck to you if you can do that.
Yeah. All right. We touched here and there general skills that are required to become a successful scientist and engineer. Let's maybe look back and at your career at then the Australian National University when you became a professor. What have you learned there as a manager, a leader, or an innovator that has served you well?
Find people who are brighter than me.
That's Steve Jobs. They're very good. Yeah.
It is lovely to be embedded in a good university like the Australian National University or the University of New South Wales, where there are so many bright people and so many intimidating students coming through. People who are just mind-bogglingly good, and you just want to hang on to them, treat them very well, and let them have their head and contribute and support them. Yeah. And then you end up with a strong group with strong people flowing through all the time.
Yeah. You have a big smile on your face in case people are just listening. So I think that's a very genuine statement here. Thanks, Andrew. So all these students that might apply or hopefully apply at your institute, how can you tell it's a talent that fits to the subject and also, let's say, to the culture in your team? And then also, how can you keep hold of them? What's important for you? What did you learn is important?
Okay, so there's a few questions there. Yeah. Most of our eventual group leaders are actually homegrown. The reason for this is that there's been exponential growth in crystalline silicon production for the whole of my career, 40 years and more. That means there's always been a short supply of really good crystalline silicon solar cell scientists and engineers. And that means it's been hard to entice really good people to come to us. So there's been plenty of people early in their career who have come for short-term postdocs, PhDs and the like, and yourself as a case in point. Then they go home and build a business or build a research group and do their own thing. And that's a wonderful thing. And bright people can make a big impact in a year or two or three. The people who tend to stay are those who typically went through the Australian education system, did a PhD with us, gone away for 5 years maybe, and come back well-versed in what's happening around the world, but they want to settle back in Australia, raise a family and the like. In Australia, they're probably much less mobile than in Europe, because Australia is such a small place and there's only ANU and UNSW in Australia. So there's a lot of swapping backwards and forwards between those two institutions.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe I would like to dig deeper. So you have this student in front of you. How do you just take everyone because they are so rare, or do you say, nah, this is what I'm looking for? Or is that a very unconscious process that you can't really talk about it? How do you? Yeah.
Well, it comes down to money, and then there's money. And there's money. Did I mention money?
No, you haven't mentioned money yet.
So many of the people who we are considering for a position, we've seen either as an undergraduate and perhaps doing their 4th year engineering project with us, or they've come through our PhD program. So we know them reasonably well. and we can judge whether they will fit in. And when we see somebody who's really good and is making noises about wanting to stay for a year or two, or perhaps return from overseas after a 5-year stint abroad, then we just try extra hard to try and procure money for them.
Yeah.
So one of the things we look for in at least half, and indeed most of the people who might become group leaders and then perhaps land in the end a tenured job is, are you skilled and capable and interested in procuring money? And almost as important, are you good at outreach? Because name recognition among the funding agencies is important.
Yeah. All right. Okay.
So somebody who wants to just dive into the lab and work, fine, we can afford to carry a few of those, but most of the senior people have to go and join the real world and get money.
Yeah.
It's just the way it is.
Yeah.
And you would know that very well from being in the real world.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting statement. I didn't expect that, but I think it's pretty intriguing. Actually, when I was in Australia, and actually I applied with Martin Green and you at the same time, and the first question then was, I think for both of you, if you cover your own cost, excellent, right? And yeah, so that aspect of funding was already there back then. Yeah.
Well, there is no base funding for either group.
Yeah.
So all the money is externally derived. There is a few academic salaries provided in return for spending half the time or a bit more teaching and admin. But in the end, all of the rest of the salaries and the cost of running the labs has to come from outside.
Yeah. Let's switch from people and money back to technology. In your career, you had to choose so many paths which you want to walk along, right? Technology paths. So that some were successes, we talked about them, some were failures. Now looking back, what do you think are particularly good signs that this path will be successful? And maybe you can give examples from your past. So sometimes there's dead ends, and how is there a learning where you could tell, I should have known, right? Back then, with my knowledge now, I should have known back then, or is it just impossible?
The paths that we take, I must say, are significantly dictated by money. It really does come down to money.
Again.
And in fact, we sometimes took quite significant projects where we could bleed significant amounts of money away to do what we really wanted to do.
All right, but then it's about what you really want to do is what I mean. Yeah, not just.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So there's been two big successes in terms of impact in my career. The first is the high efficiency work leading to perk cells early on. And the second, which might actually be much larger, is the pumped hydro work. The fact that we've identified 1 trillion EV batteries worth of storage around the world and solved overnight storage has had a very large impact on the energy policy in many countries. A very large impact. So when people are considering going solar and wind, and they look at the cost of batteries for overnight storage, they say, oh my God. And then we come along and say, well, divide that number by 10, because that's what the cost of pumped hydro will be. So pumped hydro, I think, will end up in the trillions of dollars per year investment to build the required storage. But so those are the two really good ideas that bookend my career. In the middle, there's been quite a few papers on contributing to the physics or technology or engineering of solar cells. And there are two other significant commercially possible ideas. One was concentrator systems, linear concentrators running at 20 or 30 suns where silicon can still survive. And in particular, looking at concentrator systems where you have combined heat and power. And that technology really didn't go anywhere in the end because it turned out that the cost of solar cells just fell and fell and fell. and became cheaper than building mirrors to concentrate light onto solar cells.
Yeah.
The other was the sliver solar cell. And this was a very nice idea, cooked up by Klaus Weber and myself, which ended up with a $250 million investment from Micron Semiconductor and Origin Energy, a large utility in Australia, to build, to take ordinary silicon wafers and slice them very finely vertically to make billions of very narrow strips, 5 or 10 centimeters long and a millimeter wide and about maybe 30 microns thick. And you get a very large harvest of silicon per wafer, and you get quite nice efficiencies. And this got up to 20 megawatt pilot scale. And then along came the global financial crash in 2008. And that was that.
Yeah. So you think this could be a technology we would see now on the roofs, etc., if the financial crash didn't happen? Or
no, I think it would have been wiped out in the end by the advent of commercially viable 23, 24, 25% efficient solar cells, because the edge recombination would have been more difficult to, basically the surface area of a sliver is larger per unit of energy than a large area cell. And the cost of wafers just fell through the floor.
Yeah. Talk about failures. Maybe that's a good time to talk about perovskites, because I guess that's the very important topic these days for advancing solar cell efficiency. What's your opinion? Will perovskite solar cells make it, or another material?
Never bet against silicon.
Yeah.
And I've seen at least a dozen serious attempts to bet against silicon. All of them have failed. I don't know enough about perovskites to know whether this will be the dozen and month that will fail. But I do know that I don't think perovskites will make it on their own. They'll be in a tandem format, either with themselves or with silicon.
Yeah.
I'd like to talk briefly about perovskite silicon tandems. So tandems are the way to get above 30%. I think we'll end up with 26, 27% commercial modules, but the theoretical limit of 29 and bit percent will restrict us to go beyond 30. And there's no reason we shouldn't go into the mid to high 30s. But with a tandem, why on earth are we trying to make 2-terminal tandems? It's so much easier to make 4-terminal tandems. The cost of the extra 2 terminals is neither here nor there. But the liberation that gives for choosing your top cell is wonderful. So you've got 3 requirements on your top cell. It must be stable and high efficiency and cheap. So perovskites is cheap. It might be high efficiency. It's certainly not stable. Big cross. Gallium arsenide is stable and high efficiency, but expensive. Big cross. The obvious route, to my mind, is to go up to 1.8 to 2.2 electron volt materials. So these are things like copper oxide and some of the so there's a whole range of inorganic materials that have got the right band gap, and the high band gap materials means that the silicon is providing half or even 3/4 of the power output of your tandem. So this takes the pressure off the performance of the top cell. It hugely reduces the requirements of the top cell. So getting a 6 or 8% efficient 2.2 EV top cell would be magnificent. And I think there's a large amount of work to be done at the top end of electron volts for the 4-terminal 2-component tandem.
So basically looking for stable materials, cheap, high efficient, and
very thin.
Very thin. Yeah.
So that even a quarter or a third of the light goes straight through into the silicon, even though they're direct band gap.
Yeah.
And of course, it means that your diffusion length doesn't have to be very good either.
Yeah.
Or you can have a pure drift cell.
Yeah. Andrew, we're coming to the end. My classic last question is, maybe you just answered it, but maybe there's something else. What do you think does it take to get solar that includes wind or all the renewables, to the next level? What's that big thing that needs to be solved?
It's not widely realized that we need about 100 terawatts of solar to completely decarbonize the world. So that means removing fossil fuels from every corner of the global economy, initially getting it out of electricity production, then using clean electricity to remove fossil fuels from transport, heating and industry, and then using clean electricity to create clean hydrogen, clean carbon for all of the chemical industry. So 100 terawatts of solar. And it turns out that if we keep growing the solar industry over the next 20 years, as fast as we're currently growing it, we get to 100 terawatts. So my number one requirement is we keep growing at 20% per year for the solar industry. Just double every 3 years, come back in 7 years, it's 2 to the power of 7, which is a very large number, and we have decarbonized the world.
Wonderful finish. Andrew, thank you so much. Sharp as always, or as already back in 30 years ago when I was at your university. Thanks so much. We covered a crazy large scope. That's amazing. I think that speaks for you, that you can you're all about details, but also about the big picture. I think that's a fantastic skill you have there. Thanks so much. All the best. Stay in touch. Hopefully not another 20 years or so.
Okay, thank you very much, Torsten.